Hi, Matt here. This video I will be discussing um, old technology and what its significance is, what it generally entailed, and what I think is so fascinating about some of these older devices and techniques, pieces of equipment that we had back in the 90s and before. And some of them, admittedly, maybe are actually uh, still used today. Um, One great example of that can be used today, as you can still install the floppy disk into your drive into your computer, right? Is the floppy. Floppy was developed in the late 1960s by IBM, and they started using these in their computers. This was a huge advancement at the time, so big in fact that before that you would have to use a piece of paper called a punch card, and I've actually used these before for my like payroll or my like work essentially. But you would use a punch card. It goes in and you have to read the information that's off the card, kind of like a Scantron almost, right? I'm sure you use Scantrons. Well, essentially, that's similar to a punch card, and then they moved on to, or I think it was really contemporary, and they had a lot of these around the same time. It wasn't always better because it could degrade just as much, although it may not have had the same weaknesses in terms of, you would have to patch over a punch card if something went wrong. Well, tape. They had magnetic tape that was being used. This was developed in the 1920s. And so the magnetic technology probably goes back at least till the 1920s. That eventually evolved sort of into the floppy disk. And floppies were used on mainframe computers and other computing devices, IBM products. You may know it from the PS2 line of computers, which was popular in the 80s and the 90s. Put the floppy in there. Of course, Macs and Apple computers use this as well. But this was actually a pretty big deal, especially in the 80s and up until the mid 90s, because you could put several megabytes on there, up to like 3.5 megabytes. I mean, who's ever used 4 megabytes of data before? Nobody. So 3.5 is plenty. I'm just kidding. Actually, the floppy disk evolved into a more advanced kind of technology, a number of them under the sort of umbrella name of the super floppy. But the most popular version of this super floppy was the zip drive. This was a technology that would allow you to have about 200 megabytes of data or storage available to you, and you would be able to buy an expensive drive and use that. This was developed by it was a company like Lomega. Yeah, that's right, Lomega. But eventually that sort of phased out, so you could still, as I said before, use one of these floppy disk drives today on your computer. The reason why they're not as popular, or one reason, and why we never really evolved into like 300 megabyte floppy diskettes for your computer, just because of the fact that once one of these floppy disks is damaged, it's going to be hard for it to work on your computer. This is especially if you try to cheapen, of course, the floppy disk. It's the square storage medium that you put in, like a cartridge you put in your computer. Well, the thing about that is you can either make one of these, well, or you can make it extremely cheaply. And as time went on, especially off brands, even, some better brands like Sony would start making their floppy disks out of cheaper materials. And while it would approximate the same, effects most of the time, meaning you could get it to work, all floppy disks are prone to not working sometimes. They'll actually work one day, and I remember, sometimes you'll put it in another time, it won't read correctly, right? And then later on it will actually work because it's magnetic. Well, the problem is with cheaper ones that they may wear out faster, or if you damage them in any way, it will basically not work. So I think that sums it about it up for floppy disks. Let me know if you use one. The next thing I was going to talk about is mainframes. Mainframes being very large computers that were really the original kind of computers that were used in the business world and for keeping large amounts of data. Actually being really, these are the first servers that people used. And they would take up an entire room, if not 2 rooms in some cases, because that's what it took, especially before the microization of chips and computer parts, which happened starting in the early 70s. That technology actually came from the space program. But anyway, I don't know if you believe in going to the moon. It came from the moon lander, because if you're trying to go there, you needed a navigator. Well, the navigator technology basically was where the microchip came from. Since I'm talking about older computers, and particularly mainframes used to use actually tubes, and they would be made using big tubes. This continued to be the case until even, I think, the early 90s. And but the microization of it was a big deal. And so if you're wondering why, older computers are known to take up like 3 rooms, it's because they hadn't invented smaller chips that you could put in there that would actually make it easier to like have a smaller build computer. Mainframe computers were popular from brands like VAX, DEC, IBM, PDP, maybe like SGI. These older companies that had huge computers. And the mainframes eventually evolved into supercomputers, which again, SGI made supercomputers, so did Sun. And eventually they also evolved into servers, which server rooms are now used to basically handle everything that you do on the internet in like a server fashion. A server holding, all the information on, say, a website or a company, handles a lot of business functions, payroll, and basically all the data-based information, emails, always run on a server. So mainframes would also actually, interestingly enough, so now that I think of it, those were what were used for email. You would send email, I think back from like even the mid-60s, from one mainframe to another mainframe. And the internet was developed on these, internet being developed by the military. The military had a lot of mainframes. One interesting thing is that these are so expensive, that's why you don't tend to see them anymore, because the sheer cost of them would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars even back then. Especially because computers hadn't been microized yet, or miniaturized, and therefore the cost would just be a lot more, because it takes, a bigger factory to produce one. My relatives have worked on mainframes, or people I know, and they are still used today, actually. Sometimes they're used to process data before they're brought down to smaller machines. So I find that they're still as relevant today. They evolved into a lot of powerful big supercomputers, which today are being used with AI, also being used, in our actually in COVID-19 to fight off and research the virus. And eventually, you didn't need to build a mainframe anymore. Basically, you could build a smaller computer that was like half or even a very small fraction of the size, maybe like 1/40th. And so the need for people to buy a mainframe has phased out, although they still are used. Even companies like IBM now mostly use smaller computers, which goes into my next topic, PowerPC. PowerPC is a RISC-based processor. RISC was a technology developed by David Patterson in the late 1960s, early 70s. And he was a researcher at UC Berkeley. So he started developing RISC, which stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computation. It meant that instead of using a complex instruction set, which was longer and had extended code, you could use a smaller instruction set, and basically you design your hardware around the smaller instruction set, which is basically what a RISC is and what PowerPC actually is. So this was mainly used in Macs. They would use let's say 100 megahertz RISC processor. It doesn't sound very fast by today's standards, but remember that RISC processors would go about 4 times faster, or 3 to 4 times, which is a significant increase and could mean that the programs you're running go way faster, which was a big deal. Well, Macs would use this, and I think IBM, tried using them for their computers, but they were sort of getting out of the business by then, so they started using them for servers. These were very fast processors, and even today, they can be used to process a lot of, different things at once. How a processor, maybe you don't know, but a CPU can actually be used for multiple threads, and a PowerPC chip can use, even if it's not naturally built for it, 4 or 8 threads easily, because it's just ripping through these instructions quickly. And eventually this became so powerful that the RISC-based architecture was developed and designed to fit x86, which is what you use in your computer now. Intel adapted, but PowerPC still remained really powerful and impressive. They continued designing it. Now IBM still uses these for servers, and especially they use them for AI, because if you're using an artificial intelligence, you need a lot of computational power, and that's exactly what PowerPC allows them to do. This was also used by companies like Nintendo and Microsoft and Sony, but I think they still use it in gambling machines and a lot of different servers. And remember, RISC is used in 99% of computers today. Even though it's not used in desktops, most computers aren't actually desktop or laptop computers, but they're actually cell phones. And not only that, but smaller computational devices that don't need a very big chip, and that's why they use RISC. But as IBM has become less powerful, you see PowerPC less, but it was very influential, and was one of the things that actually helped Apple to achieve its dominance and the prevalence, and really allow the iMac to meet its goal of being this media-based machine, because you could do a lot with videos and going on the internet by using this technology, especially in the 90s when there was slower technology, slower connections, the speeds just weren't what they are today. So having that extra power allowed you to do a lot more with less, or what you had. And actually this was used up until, actually quite commonly, I think that these chips were very common up until about 2014. And Apple discontinued them in like 2006, but it still served its purpose for around 15 years, so that's pretty impressive. The next topic is big hard drives. Companies used to use very large hard drives in order to keep their data. They would have like 512 megabytes, 300 megabytes, 200 megabytes, and sometimes as time went on, you would get to a gigabyte, 2 gigabytes of data. And they still weren't small yet, but at least you could hold large amounts of data. Because remember, at one point, a single gigabyte was like a massive amount of data. And certainly, that's why when you got to smaller hard drives, they tended to carry like less than a gigabyte in the early 90s, because it was just so small amount of data. So, you would actually use a forklift to move one of these things around, and they were very common. You had to have people working for a company just to move them around, and they had head disk assembly. It would screw onto the computer. It was about the size of a washing machine, maybe bigger. And so you would have like a machine, you move it over with a forklift, and a crane or a machine would screw it in, and voila, you have your functioning hard drive, which gives you your 1 gigabyte, massive gigabyte or 2 of storage. And so that's the most amazing technology that ever existed back then. Of course, as time went on, they were able to miniaturize this, but don't think that a hard drive was always just a small rectangle that you see in your computer today, let alone further advancements that have occurred since then. But it's interesting that this like when you think of larger amounts of data, I think this continued using these for quite a while. You might have had like 500 gigabyte ones in the mid 90s. So that's, and some of these they called HDA, head disk assembly, because you'd screw on the head of the computer or the drive. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that part. Let's see, what else was I going to talk about here? DOS. DOS was the original operating system by Microsoft. It was before they had menus and things like that, because and really a user interface that would make a lot of sense, because they had to kind of look at what Apple or Mac was doing, and like what Sun was doing, which was a company, and figure out how to apply a user interface like that. Again, it was harder unless you had like a RISC-based processor, or just a processor that was fast enough to actually handle that, let alone the visual components of it, and even forget making it color, because that technology it existed, but you were lucky to have it if you did. I'll just put it that way. So I think DOS was popular for a number of years, and it's also what you use on a command prompt. Bill Gates actually worked heavily on this, and he designed it, and you can still use it in your computer today in order to access different commands. And I think you could eventually get games on there, but it was very limited as to what you could do. You had to basically type in what you wanted to do, or click on a couple programs. And but interestingly enough, DOS, the black and white forefather of what your computer is using now, was actually the original operating system which Microsoft developed. And thank goodness, because if they didn't, we wouldn't have what we have today, which is really a huge advancement, although I think that they could be, sometimes they're going a bit too far with touchscreen like devices and things. But yeah, have you ever used the command prompt? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave any questions below if you want to, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of my channel, my show, if you will. Leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, and have a great day. Thank you.